Hello and welcome to financialexpress.com. I'm Shaleen Agrawal. Today we are talking to Mr. John Denton. John, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
John, what are the challenges that global businesses are facing right now, especially in the light of economic uncertainties around the globe?
Well, look, great question. I suppose there's a number of different perspectives that you can look at it through. Maybe the first is this what's seen as the converging crises that confront the world, partly as a response to the regional conflict between Russia and Ukraine after the illegal invasion of Russia of Ukraine. But also there's still the trail coming out of the COVID period. And actually, there's still a trace coming through from the global financial crisis. It's sort of all compounding upon itself. And so as a consequence, if you look at these polycrises, as they're called, around finance, energy, and food, this is something that is just troubling, I think, the global economy as we move forward. The other issue is around the ability of companies to have confidence about geopolitical settings, geoeconomic settings, which is actually challenged at the moment, as you can imagine. There's also a sense of vulnerability, which is around, who isn't really looking at the effectiveness of their supply chains, particularly as a global value chain leader or as a company that actually operates in more than 2 or 3 countries and actually built their supply chains on the basis of comparative economic advantage and now discovers that actually that's no longer relevant to policymakers, it's more around security. When you see the financial crises played out and you see the number of sovereign debt or sovereign downgrades that are happening, that's also having immediate impact on the way in which companies can operate, because if you think about it, the actual interest rates on their or whatever loans they have or the trade finance they get access to, if they can still get access to it, they're actually higher because they can't be lower than the sovereign grading in which the country in which they originate. And that's actually now starting to have an impact on the business's ability to trade across borders. And frankly, that's actually having it's another challenge to supply chain operability as well. So there's a number of kind of, shadows out there over 2023. There are actually, however, on the other side, some greater sense of optimism that could start to be crafted together. Even though it's been pretty tough, the way in which people have been grappling with the rise in inflation, we're starting to see some signs that the interventions of basically the reserve banks or the federal banks on a global basis is starting to have some impact. But there's still pain to be felt as we work our way through that as well. But that does seem to be shifting, and there is some optimism there. But, on a daily basis, if you're in business, what you're actually seeing is I saw Microsoft announce it's going to be terminating some 10,000 jobs. You see some of the big tech players doing the same thing. People are buckling up for what looks like a tough ride. But business people always know that there's opportunities in that. And if you've actually got your house in order, there may well be opportunities. But we at the ICC know that one of our roles is, when you even look at these global compounding crises, we've got to find a way of unpicking those so that there's less pressure on the food security issues, there's less pressure on the energy issues, there's less pressure on the finance crisis as well. So that's what we're working on at the same time, as trying to help companies work their way through what looks like pretty rough economic environment before us.
A lot of information packed into one answer there.
Probably too much.
Not too much, never too much. But very interesting points you made about supply chains being tilted towards security rather than economic forces, and then traces of financial crisis as well. Would you want to elaborate on that? What are the traces of financial crisis that are still we are still seeing?
Well, I think there's a number of economies that have never really recovered from the global financial crisis in an effective way. And if you think about it, one of the challenges that we see as for the global economy is the growing kind of separation between the North and the South here. And obviously, the South is not a uniform story, but there's real pressure, particularly on a number of developing and least developed countries. They haven't really worked their way through. They took on a lot more additional debt on the way through. Yes, One of the benefits was that debt was cheaper, but the problem now is that with the rise in the value, say, of the US dollars, particularly if their debt is denominated in the US dollars, then actually the cost of their debt is increasing and they can't service it. So you've got that kind of problem still coming through. You've also got a problem even in some middle income economies, and you saw that starting to be compounded a bit during the COVID crisis, which, COVID, there was a distance between the global financial crisis and COVID, but as I said, you hadn't completely unwound the complications caused for economies from that. And you certainly see that in a number of the middle income economies. That was particularly sharp in Latin America. We had actually seen a number of middle income economies there who were unable to get access to the kind of financing required from multilateral development banks because they didn't qualify. So actually you saw further pressures built on those economies, and that's actually hasn't unwound itself fully either. So there's a few things sort of compounding there which are yet to be unpicked. And I suppose the underlying issue there is the financial architecture that actually enables the world to function effective for the 21st century. Are we still got too many traces of, I think, old thinking about how economies operate? Do we need to rethink the way the financial architecture operates to enable greater access to liquidity rather than just debt to these nations as well?
We also mentioned about supply chains being tilted more towards security. Has that created trade barriers?
I think people are still struggling with this idea of how they reconstitute their supply chains. There is no doubt that there are challenges at the moment, and you saw the way that supply chains were effectively interfered with by governments during COVID. And now, of course, there's other issues to do with the attractiveness of maintaining supply chains, where the governments are saying they'd rather have those supply chains friend-shored, if that's the term, or near-shored. And of course, there's going to be a bit of that. You've seen a number of economies, a number of companies that are just too overweight in terms of risk in one economy, so they're going to need to redraw their supply chains. That is actually causing problems, I think. I'm not saying they're insuperable problems. And the issue that really underpins all this is that previously we'd all worked on the basis, particularly, say, in Asia Pacific, which was built around the supply chain success story, which has really helped drive the way in which those economies function, the tigers, where they're able to arbitrage their labour costs to actually make themselves more attractive as a comparative advantage, and actually then build the systems or the standards to support all that. The unpicking of all that will actually cause, I think, interruptions and add costs to the delivery of goods and services on a global basis. And how's that going to work for consumers? How's that going to work for consumers? So there's some issues there. So I said, comparative advantage was the basis in which supply chains were developed. We're seeing already with semiconductors, that's no longer the actual basis upon which semiconductors are. Look at the Semiconductor Act, it's not about comparative advantage, that's actually about security issues.
Is there a scope to open up those supply chains right now, or should the governments wait a little more?
Well, I think for a start, what are the economics around all this? And also there seems to be a hypothesis that the world is going to split into two competing factions. It doesn't, or two competing, the China-aligned markets, the US-aligned markets. I think India is proving it doesn't have to be like that. There is no requirement that even though there can be geostrategic competition, the world has to actually split into two different economic models. That doesn't actually happen. That's in no one's interest for that to happen. So I would be urging that economics is actually understood and actually becomes the basis upon which trade continues to operate, and rather than allow security to be the dominant force in the way the economy operates. And I suppose that's part of what the ICC is about, which is we actually think that the most important thing for peace, security and opportunity is effectively functioning markets. And we think effectively functioning markets operate better, not in state-directed economies, but in open economies, which are actually driven by market and democratic capitalism. So we would like to see that at the forefront about how you maintain that as the guiding principle for the way in which global commerce operates, and therefore how supply chains operate as well.
It's very interesting that as a theory that principle is understood by everyone, but in practice we see a lot of trade barriers still.
But I think that often goes to politics, and often that's in a way the failure of business from time to time to really explain that to argue the case for open economic settings in a way that is more than just saying, well, it's because we make money from it. It's really because it's actually in the interests of the communities. But also, we're not just telling people, we're showing people how they can benefit from an open economy, open economic settings, from the ability of traders to trade across borders, etc., and to lower the costs of that. What's in it for the citizens? And that's something that's really important. And I think we need to be able to show that more and more. Because really that's one of the challenges as to why the WTO is under threat, is because people see trade as the reason they've lost their livelihoods. Trade is the reason they've actually seen their income diminish. Trade is the reason the business that's in their community has been forced to close. Whereas it's actually about a lot of other things as well. It's got a lot more to do with technological innovation and change. What we need to be showing is how do we build the skills to enable citizens to participate? How do we give them the comfort and security for their families in the future as well, to participate and become net winners out of open economic settings, net winners out of international, the ability of companies to trade internationally. That's something, I think that's a real challenge for us.
Very interesting that you mentioned that about WTO. It was not in my original talk points, but since you've mentioned it, if we probably can keep it brief, whatever you said about WTO, then what is the relevance of WTO going forward, and how can WTO make its case to the world that open trade is in everyone's interest, including each individual nation's own?
I think we're really blessed at the moment that the WTO is proving that good leadership can actually make a difference, and I think that Dr. Ngozi has actually made a difference there. I think most people would say that the question that was being asked was like, how long until the WTO basically renders itself irrelevant? We've always argued that the WTO, it's not so much the initials that matter, it's the fact of the matter that there needs to be some, I suppose, curation of this important public commons, which is around global trading rules, because it's so important for the global economy. And that is best articulated through an institution. But the institution has to be functional. And so our aim is always to have a functional WTO. And there is no doubt that the functionality, the relevance of the WTO was drifting. I mean, where was it during COVID? It was not actually meeting. It was not looking at these and bringing on these issues to do with interruptions to supply chain, or it wasn't focused on ensuring the adequate distribution of vaccines, etc. It wasn't debating these sorts of, so it was kind of rendering itself out. Where is it on the digital economy, or those sorts of stuff? But I think most people assumed that that slippery slide was going to continue. We backed Dr. Ngozi's appointment because we do think a leader with a vision can make a difference. Obviously, we brought the, I suppose, considerable influence and clout that we have in order to give effect to a lot of the ambitions that she holds, but also members who understand that institution must be functional. Which is why this thing called MC12, the ministerial meeting, last year was seen as a litmus test. If they couldn't deliver a successful outcome there, then frankly people would be moving on. Well, they did, and we obviously worked very hard to ensure that happened, but that would not have happened without a good leader who was actually capable of I think, articulating a future, but the relevance of a properly curated public commons like a global trade regulatory setup, a global trade marker such as the WTO. So I think it is very important. And of course, the proof is in the pudding. Work is now happening for the first time on fisheries subsidies. Work was able to be maintained on stopping the moratorium collapsing, around tariffs being placed on data transfers on a global basis, all these sorts of issues. These are important. And talk is now taking place with some substance around the e-commerce track. So all these elements are there. There's more that needs to happen. It needs to be revitalised. We hope that the India G20 leadership will take this on as well, because India, in the end, played a very constructive role in delivering an MC12, which was successful.
Very interesting that you brought us to G20. How's ICC gearing up for that, and what is India doing right now in run-up to G20 leadership?
Well, one reason I'm here is because this is the commencement of the India G20 year, so I wanted to be here in January at the same time. I spent some time here late last year talking to the leadership in government and also business about the prospects and opportunities. And I have to say that we think India played an extremely constructive role in delivering a successful G20 last year. And I think it just goes to show India, when fully engaged in a matter of such importance as global economic architecture, which is really what the G20 is about how do you drive the global economy in the 21st century, is actually an important player. And it worked very closely, I think, with the Indonesian leadership last year to deliver what was seen by many as a surprisingly successful G20 when you think of all the complexity between US, China, the participation of Russia, all these sorts of elements. It was very successful. And I think that slipstream has now created an opportunity. For me, the genius of the G20 in the India year is, as I said before in my earlier comments, one of the problems we see is this north-south divide happening, this absence of trust. What I like and what I think is a real prospect here, and I think this is something that Prime Minister Modi recognises as a particular strength of India, is its South-South leadership. And bringing that into this G20 architecture, this G20 economic development, process is going to be very important. Bringing the global South in and the leadership that India can play on that around innovation, access to digital economy, the issues that really matter, I think is going to be an important opportunity to turn this from a good G20 into a better G20.
Will there be real tangible outcomes out of G20?
Well, that's what we're trying to encourage. I mean, what I've been saying is, from a ICC perspective, there's a couple of things. We think there can be real progress made on enabling the digital economy in the 21st century, but there's practical markers of that. Will we have legal recognition of electronic transmittable records, which are really like, if you take trade from analog to digital, how do you ensure that an electronic bill of lading has legal standard? That might sound like a slightly esoteric argument, but without that, you'll never actually get the whole trading world moving from analog to digital and therefore lowering the costs of trading and actually increasing its efficiency. That is something that can be an outcome, a practical, tangible outcome. There's also issues around how do you reform access to trade finance to ensure that the real economy gets that. That is something where India can play a critical role. We've actually got some ideas that we put up on this issue as well. There are really tangible things that can be done. I mean, we have to move away from the 80,000 metre high sort of rhetorical stances and actually start looking at some practical outcomes that can really mark a successful G20 from an Indian perspective. How do we ensure that the issue of debt and liquidity is dealt with effectively this year? The comprehensive piece that was actually devised by the G20, which continues on, but has actually been availed of by so few countries, actually becomes relevant and useful. These sorts of things will be very practical outcomes and are in the interest of the Global South. And in the interests of the Global South, they're also in the interests of an inclusive economy. And in the interests of an inclusive economy is actually good for global economic development. Isn't that the purpose of the G20?
Sure. What would be a successful year of G20 look like?
Well, I think for me, at the end of this year, when Prime Minister Modi announces an agreed communique, which will actually have within it the reform of the WTO as a commitment of all parties, that will have within it the formula which will actually restructure the way in which debt is dealt with on a global basis to take that pressure of so many developing and emerging economies and a number of middle income economies, how we can actually get more liquidity flowing to those economies as well, how we can get action on climate, which is actually matched in a way, not just with the rhetoric, but with the financing. All these elements will show a successful G20.
You mentioned debt quite a lot of times in this conversation. How would you like the debt to be handled at that level?
Well, I think all the parties need to be involved. I mean, the reality is that, and I was just mentioning in my discussions earlier today, I heard the governor of the Reserve Bank in India talk about his genuine concern about the debt crises in South Asia. he's not talking about this as an academic interest out of the future. He's talking about this as a risk. Because what's happening is that you've seen what's happening in Sri Lanka, you've seen what's happening now in Bangladesh. Something needs to give here. So we need to find a way of providing some kind of relief for those debtor nations so that they can actually work their way through the debt crisis.
Sure, but what could that be?
But I mean, for us, what we're saying is there needs to be restructuring, say, of the Paris Club. You need to bring China into the Paris. You need to find a way of bringing of China into the Paris Club so that you actually have all parties to global debt involved here. And these are sort of things that we're discussing at the moment. This is something we're discussing in the Global Crisis Response Group at the UN as well. How do you ensure that we crack this nut of debt? Because without that, you're never going to crack the nut of access to liquidity as well.
At the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned about food security. What was ICC's role in ensuring food security or augmenting food security during the recent crisis?
Well, just practical. So one of I mentioned before that I was appointed by Guterres to participate in the Global Crisis Response Group. In fact, I just gave a speech earlier today to the International Grains Council where they asked me to identify how we actually were able to help here. And I thought it's the point that people have actually picked up on is that we saw quite quickly the consequences of that regional conflict between Russia and Ukraine in food prices and also futures market on prices, because we're in every country. And we saw in Lebanon, for example, the food prices go up by 1,000% because there was a fear there'd be no access to the food grain or the food basket, which was the Ukraine, and access to fertilizers. And so we conceived of this idea of, first of all, understanding how logistics operated in Ukraine, because we still support some 25 chambers of commerce in Ukraine, so we understand the way in which the food distribution system operates there, that you were never going to be able to resolve this issue through rail or road. You were going to have to find a way to open up sea freight because of the size of containers that are required to actually move the grain and the sunflower out of the Ukraine. So we're needed to find a way to reopen that, because everyone said, well, it can't be done because the countries are at war. But our view, and this is the view I took to Secretary General Guterres, is it could be done. The only room in which it could be done is the United Nations room. There is enough reasons why it could be in both parties' interest for this to happen. There needed to be some sort of equanimity with opportunity for Russia and Belarus to move fertilizer, ammonia and nitrate, etc. out as well. So we took the idea of the Black Sea Initiative and we showed how it could be done, what the elements should be, to Guterres before his trip to Moscow and Kiev, his first trip to Moscow and Kiev in the midst of the crisis. He asked for this. He asked for a briefing from us about how to do it. He then took the idea and he then came back and was able to achieve that. What that did immediately was actually lower the fear factor about access to food, which actually lowered the pricing, as you understand. So you've seen that. And you saw when Russia talked about withdrawing from the agreement a weekend about a month ago or 6 weeks ago, you saw the immediate spike in food prices go up. But when they came back down again. So that agreement, I think, and the conception of that was an initiative of the ICC. The actual execution in terms of the negotiations obviously was done by Guterres in the room, but with the support of Turkey, which has been critical. And of course, that's another reason I think it's important to involve the private sector, because sometimes coming up with those ideas has to come from outside the usual party, the usual suspects. And that's something we've been able to do because we saw it as important to the business communities, and we got first-hand knowledge of the crisis, but we also understood a lot of the logistics about why we need to start looking at different options as well.
One last question on what are the pockets of opportunities for exporters from developing nations such as India right now amid all the clouds over global economy, so to speak?
Well, I mean, I think one of the exciting things, and this is something that, by the way, I think is going to be a critical opportunity for India G20 year and for India within that context, is the innovation that comes out of places like India. One of the points we make is that innovation, I suppose it goes back to one of my earlier responses to your questions, innovation should not only be seen as a product of the North. Innovation comes from the South. And I think India leads in that. What I would like to see is the same kind of entrepreneurial focus and the capability building that in India has been brought about, particularly in the digital sector and elsewhere, is actually part then of a South-South discussion reason we created our centres of entrepreneurship, particularly in developing and emerging economies, is to create a kind of global ecosystem around that will enable that to happen. I think innovation will still lie at the core of opportunity for developing and emerging nations. We just need to find a way of encouraging it and nurturing it, because that is where value will be created, and that's something we're working on right now.
How does that help any developing nation integrate better with the global trade system?
Well, you're bringing value on a constant basis. You're always bringing value, new ways of doing things, new markets new niches within markets that can be served, using the comparative advantage of your labour costs to intervene there and almost restructure global value chains as well. All that can happen, but we need to actually get those capabilities. We need to encourage that kind of way of thinking in these economies. It's a way of also giving people the opportunity to create value for themselves and their families and their communities. It's another reason why open markets driven by innovation, driven pursuit of profit is actually a good thing.
What can government do to foster that kind of innovation or boost innovation?
Well, I think they need to understand better how they can create systems, access to finance, enable a constancy of the regulatory frameworks that actually allow that to happen, respect for intellectual property, all those sorts of elements, all the fundamentals of effective functioning open market economies is something that governments should continue to be focused on. But aligning much more the education and capability build to support that, thinking about the future rather than the past, is pretty key. And I think we see that a lot in India. Getting that, because this is a big heaving country, getting all those parts aligned is actually challenging. But when that happens, it can actually be very effective.
Shouldn't the best way for the government is to just stay away and let the innovation prosper?
Yeah, I mean, I think the traditional view is, get out of my way if you're the government. But I think the reality here, and this is something that's been proven through the global financial crisis, through through COVID, even through these global crises, it's when government is aligned with what is necessary to achieve a strong, positive economic outcome for their country, and they're not in the way, but actually enabling, that is a powerful thing. So you can't just say government go away here. Governments are often important players within the economy. You just need to ensure that they're actually forward-looking and actually aligned with and engaging with business in a productive public-private partnership. That can actually be useful. But learning how to speak each other's language is also important as well.
Any closing advice for the government and Indian businesses on how to handle 2023?
Well, I think what I really like about what you're seeing at the moment in India is a common view about building a future, a set of opportunities for India to mark its 75th and its 100th anniversary. And what they're really saying there is, how do we ensure that we're focusing on those elements of our economy which will be relevant and productive and value-laden for that. So that's not just a government perspective, that's a business perspective, and that should also be a civil society perspective. A proper public-private partnership building the future is actually the key element, I think, that needs to be engaged in.
John, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks very much.